Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk a little bit about how a farmer can preserve the hay that he's just baled.
You know, one of the stories that I've got growing up as a kid, my cousins lived a little bit further west into South Dakota than we were in further north, and we were going up to see my cousins. And I remember seeing these piles of hay sitting out in fields and pastures and so forth that had been there for several years. And some of the bales didn't look like they were in the best condition. I mean, not pristine like they would be immediately after they were baled. And I asked my dad, I said, why are there still piles of hay here? And he said, you know, Darren, he goes, what happens with guys as you move further west, they have a lot of dry years. And so when they have a good wet year, they'll bale a lot of hay. The ground will be very productive, whether it's grassland or alfalfa, they'll get more bales than they can possibly use that year. So they'll save them up for multiple years, knowing that, hey, when we get to a dry year, we won't have enough grass for the cattle to graze on. We've got to use those old bales up for feed. And I got thinking about that. Wow, what do we do to preserve those bales? How do bales keep for more than 1 year? So every time farmers are baling, they're thinking about the long term of, I want to make sure I don't have spoilage so I have good feed. And also I want to be able to keep those bales as long as possible, because if I don't need them this year, I want to make sure they're still good for next year too.
Well, the main thing here is really moisture. So farmers are trying to keep the moisture off the hay, whether it's grass hay, alfalfa hay, whatever type of hay it is, it doesn't make any difference. If it gets a whole bunch of moisture on it, there's just a much greater chance that it's going to spoil. Well, this isn't a big issue as you go to some of these western areas like Darren mentioned. This is further west in South Dakota where they get a lot less rainfall than what we do. They're not as concerned. But as you go east in the country and they get lots of rainfall, it's a really big deal. So there are a number of different methods that farmers will use to preserve the hay, and obviously keeping it inside would be ideal, but it's expensive to put hay inside a shed all the time.
All right, well, there are different ways that you can bale up hay, whether it's big squares, large round bales, or small squares, as you're all aware. And when we look at how those bales are stacked, certainly they're stacked to try to shed water, but there's been a lot more bale wrap being used than has ever been used before. The other thing is, just as they're being baled up, we're looking at having the tightest bales we can have, and that the looser the bale is, the more air and water can penetrate into that bale. So farmers will try to do everything they can to make those bales, whether it's a small square or a big round bale, wrapped as tightly as they can together to try to repel as much water and keep the oxygen out as well.
All right, why don't you talk about hay preservatives and what that can do for a farmer?
The big thing that farmers will look at is, what's the weather forecast when I'm going to cut my hay, between the time I'm going to cut it and how long it's going to take for that hay to dry, and then I can get it baled. If, let's just say we're in the middle of the summer and a farmer figures, you know, if I can cut that hay, if I can leave it lay out in the sun for a couple of days, it'll be dry enough that I can bale it. So they'll look at the forecast. If it's not going to rain for a 2 or 3 day period, they'll start cutting hay like crazy and then try to get it baled up. Well, on the chance that, you know, the weather forecast changed, now it looks like it might rain. Farmers will say, ooh, I want to try and get that hay, but it's not quite ready. So with the baling equipment, they can try to crimp or bend some of that hay a little bit to squish out some of that moisture to help that hay cure up a little more quickly. Also, they can use some acid type preservatives or bacterial type preservatives. So even if the hay is a little bit more wet, they can reduce any potential spoilage that they may have.
How about safety to the livestock with the preservatives? Some non-farmers will ask that and be very concerned. Oh, you're going to spray something on there. That can't be good.
There's really no safety issue at all. When you look at what, say, a cow is going to eat, when we're putting corn silage in a silo, when we're putting a hay preservative on, we aren't talking about anything that's foreign to what that cow's diet is going to be. In fact, when you look at corn stalks, a lot of times you'll have cattle grazing corn stalks in the fall. They prefer the ones that have a little bit of rot to them. They're a little softer, a little easier to chew. Now, when I'm looking at the human food supply, I don't want something that's rotting.
Yeah, but you make this case, so then why would a farmer put preservative on at all?
Well, they want that to be fresh and healthy for their livestock, and they don't want to have spoilage because they may keep it for a long term. For cattle, if they're out chewing on stalks, hey, that's today's meal, and a little bit of rot is no big deal. But if I have hay that I want to keep for 2 or 3 years, I certainly can't have any rot. The other thing that can happen when you get some rot going, if let's just say you put the hay into a hay shed, now you could have a fire if some heat gets going in there. That would be a really bad thing too.
Well, once again, it's very important for farmers to do everything they can to preserve hay for the short term and especially for the long term.
The other thing that's really important for farmers is to control weeds, whether it's in a hay field or anywhere else on their farm. If you have this week's weed of the week, you want to get it under control. Can you identify this week's weed?